Welcome to the Business of Business. I'm Perrin Beatty, President and CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. And throughout the pandemic, I'll be hosting a series of conversations with government officials, business leaders, and other experts on how Canada and Canadian businesses are responding to COVID-19. Our guest today is Emilio Imbriglio, who's a CV that any three people would be happy to share. Emilio has been President and CEO of Raymond Chabot Grant Thornton since 2013. He leads a team of 2,800 professionals in more than 100 offices in Quebec and the Ottawa and Edmundston, New Brunswick regions. He's a multilingual who speaks 4 languages and is a member of the Strategy Committee and Board of Governors of Grant Thornton International Limited, representing over 135 countries, as well as chair of its Budget and Audit Committee. Emilio was professor at Concordia and McGill Universities for 18 years. He continues to share his knowledge with the next generation, especially the firm's up-and-coming young talent. Now, in addition to his day job, Emilio has served as a corporate director, as well as playing an active role in a wide range of community organizations. He has received a number of Canadian and international awards that recognize his many achievements and contributions, including being named a Knight of the Order of Merit of the Italian Republic, which was awarded by the President of Italy. Emilio, welcome to the Business of Business. What a great career you've had. What a CV.
Thank you, Perrin. I wasn't expecting the long version, but I thank you very, very much. Clearly, your researchers do a good job.
Well, let's start with the impact of COVID-19 on business, and particularly on your business. We're now 6 months into the lockdowns. But we're moving to a new phase. Students are going back to school. Hundreds of thousands of Canadians are going back to work. What was the impact of the lockdowns on Raymond Chabot Grant Thornton? How have you managed during this time?
Well, it's interesting to see Canadians, and we'll include ourselves in that, react in the most positive of ways. I mean, for a 3-month period, we went from labor shortages to basically in hibernation. And we asked all of these businesses to shut down, unless they were really essential services, to shut down. We were fortunate because we're considered an essential service. We believe we are because not in the same way as healthcare, of course, but businesses do have to go and apply for government aid, talk to their bankers, talk to their stakeholders, make sure that their employees are on board, and they counted on our firm. And you did mention we're almost 60,000 people worldwide. We're across Canada, and we have 160 offices across Canada. And entrepreneurs came knocking at our doors, and we reacted very quickly with thought leadership, with presentations, with webinars. Would you believe, Perrin, that one of our webinars had 3,000 people on government aid, and these are 3,000 businesses? Now, that statistic in and of itself is quite impressive, but there's another statistic that's even more impressive, is that 1,800 of them had a follow-up call. So they needed something. They had something that they actually had a follow-up on.
That's amazing.
So we feel that as an organization, and we are a business, we have to say the truth. I mean, we have clients, they depend on us for advice, but we are also a business. We had to get into a crisis management mode, modify the governance, streamline it, become far more agile, make decisions with regards to resiliency, make sure that our top line was protected as our clients, that we were creative in doing that. We also had to make sure that we were making decisions for future prosperity and ongoing business continuity, and that we managed our own stakeholders. So I had, I don't know how many calls with all partners, how many calls with all employees, something we never really do, speak to all 2,800 at the same time. And you said we have 100 offices, but for a 3-month period, we had 2,800 offices. Every home was an office. So they were even closer to their clients, speaking to the clients. So it was a big challenge. I mean, of course, nobody would want the healthcare crisis we had, but from a purely a managerial point of view, it's been a fascinating experience and people stepped up to the plate. Yeah.
You're a large business. So you were mentioning prior to our starting this recording that that you changed the structure of governance throughout the
Right.
pandemic to make it more supple and more reactive. How did you change that?
Our forefathers, because there's constitutions at the federal government, provincial governments, but there's a constitution that runs our business. It's called the partnership agreement. So whenever they drafted this partnership agreement, and it's gone through evolution, they had a clause that's just not often used. It was never used in 72 years. So the agreement was drafted in 1948, and it's called managing crises. So in order to manage crises, you had to fill three criteria. This one filled it, like it was the first time in 72 years that something would fill it. And what it created is it allows the CEO to create a crisis management committee. Of course, politically, you have to make sure it's got proper representation. It's 5 people, including myself, and it substitutes itself to the board and to the management committee for all areas that touch the crisis. So that's what we put in place on Monday, the 23rd of March. That team is still in place for only crisis-related matters. It reports to the board, and it allowed us to gain in agility. It allowed us to map out where things were going. It's interesting because I cited this quote from Sidney Crosby, where they asked him, what's the difference between a good player and a great player? And he said, a good player plays where the puck is, a great player plays where the puck is going to be. And all managers right now are managing with uncertainty. Of course, we all manage with uncertainty. We don't have all facts, but this is extreme uncertainty. Mm-hmm. And you need to play out scenarios, a lot of scenarios, most probable scenarios, and you need to shorten time. So instead of budgeting for 1 year, we put ourselves, as we asked our clients to do, on 12-week rolling forecasts. We created every month a new forecast for a 12-month rolling forecast. And it allowed us to, and we've inherited a lot of these things. They've become permanent. So some of these management techniques we found were so useful in the extraction of data from our ERP and the business intelligence we were driving in order to increase resilience. Were so useful that we showed it to clients, implemented it in clients, build thought leadership around it. And we're very, very pleased because it will survive the crisis. It'll improve us as a business going forward.
Well, we're now past Labor Day. What percentage of your staff would be back into physical offices?
As with everything else right now, you can't use averages anymore. So everything is by industry, by region, by city, by office. So the biggest distinction is between major metropolitan areas and regional offices. If the regional office is on a floor that you can walk up the stairs, let's say less than 3 floors, they've been, the law allows up to 50% for essential services, and they have been at that level since the beginning, and nothing's changed. Whereas in the building I'm in right now, we have 5 floors. It's a 27-story building. Getting everybody in this building is an impossibility because you can only put 2 people in the elevator at once. So our offices in the major metropolitan cities are still working at way below 25%. For example, today on this one floor, we're 900 people in this office. On this one floor today, there's about 9 people. Everyone's working from home. So it's a huge, huge difference. And we're encouraging people to work from home if they can. There's nothing wrong with coming in the office. It's very, very safe. There's signage everywhere. I have a conference room adjacent to my office. It's normally for 8 people. It's now for 2, 1 at each end. That's 2 meters. So, I mean, it's changed the way we work. Our training room can sit 60 people. It can sit 8 right now, respecting a 2 meters radius around every person.
It's a great irony that our most densely populated regions, our metropolitan centers in the country, are the ones that are going to be most empty, and that will return to normal in the least populated areas in many ways.
But at the same time, those people are all working. every single one of those people is working on their clients, some of them going to the clients, so long as the client is respecting an equivalent standard as what we have, and being able to do most of what they normally do, including maintaining relationships they already had, especially if there was trust in place from a distance, virtual relationships, if you want.
Now, many of the CEOs with whom I've spoken have said that they've made changes, and you were alluding to that earlier, changes to respond to the pandemic, but they're not going to go back to the way it was before, that many of these changes will be permanent. Now, what sort of changes do you see in the structure of Raymond Chabot, Grant Thornton, either to how you function or in terms of the physical structure once the pandemic is over?
Well, I mean, some of the things we would put in place were because of healthcare, health protection. So we created bubbles. Every office in our business is a bubble. You cannot go from one office to another office for fear of being the source of contagion. So everything is limited to on a per office basis. And even within that, for example, technology, they've separated into bubbles also, so that they don't cross bubbles when they come back to the office, or we would be at risk of losing key personnel. Now, when things come back to normal, if they come back to normal and there's a vaccine, proper treatment, I suspect a lot of that will go back to normal. What won't go back to normal is that those services that are actually performing better in the existing situation, the business model is going to have to change. So if client service can be performed at a distance, I think our employees will come back to the office, especially in major metropolitan cities, when they need team meetings, when they need three-dimension, when they're trying to build trust as opposed to build on trust. If I already have trust, like you and I can have this conversation at a distance, but we've met many, many times in my offices and so on. And it's a different conversation than, for example, winning a pitch with somebody who's never met us. Mm-hmm. That's a tougher thing to do. So that will have to come back in the way we used to work in the past.
You've made an important distinction there between functions that can be performed at a distance and relationships and other functions that you have to be face-to-face and meet people. Absolutely. Certainly, I've found through Zoom meetings and others that I've been able to attend annual meetings to speak at them that I simply couldn't have afforded the time and the money to fly to the other side of the country to do that for a single meeting, or that I've been able to meet with CEOs and others from our membership. But for the most part, these were existing relationships.
Yeah.
And when we have a virtual AGM, for example, all of the side conversations that you have when you go to a conference are lost, and you don't develop the same sort of network and relationship.
Yeah, the corridor, what happens in the corridors is not happening right now. We will have this year our first virtual annual partners meeting. It's happening on the 17th of September. Of course, it's limited to half a day instead of 2 days. The things that would normally happen that would keep building relationships are going to happen in a very different way. Is that a sustainable model in terms of building relationships? I don't know, but I find that young kids are telling us something. When you speak to mothers and fathers who have sent younger kids back to school, you'd figure they're stressed, which they are, but the kids are super happy. And that tells us that relationships, we live for relationships. You know, I've never met an 85 or 90-year-old person who talks a lot about money, but they talk about their kids and their families and their friends and so on and so forth. So the children are sending us a message that it's important that that be maintained because you can't otherwise function properly, and it affects your psychological well-being too. But I must agree that, for example, I don't think I'll wind up going to the London meetings 7 times or 6 times or 5 times a year anymore. That might become limited to 1 or 2 times. So our international boards, I suspect, will never come back to what they were before. We'll have more frequent meetings, much shorter. They won't take 2 days, and they might happen 8 times a year, but 7 of those 8 times will be over a virtual tool. The other thing, Perry, that I think we shouldn't forget is that we're on, there's tools like Zoom and many others, Teams, and Google has their products and so on. The speed at which they're being updated. So the first time you got on these platforms, we were 2, and then you could see 3, and then 9, and then an entire auditorium, and then as many people as you want. So for example, last version of Microsoft Teams, they have the auditorium feature. You can have 100 people on that, which we've had many times. They're a little small, depending on the size of the screen, but I mean, these tools, there's so much money being thrown at them. They will evolve, they will change, and they will become far more personal also.
It's astonishing to see how rapidly this is evolving. And I was in Toronto at the time of SARS, and there's just absolutely no way with the technology we had in those days that if it had been COVID-19 instead of SARS, we couldn't have functioned.
Well, you're touching on technology again. I go even further, and I'm going to venture here and say that this is true about probably 85% of organizations, but pre-cloud, they could not have functioned. That includes us. I mean, yeah, I could access at a distance a lot of stuff pre-cloud, but right now there's nothing I can't do that isn't exactly identical as to when I'm in the office. So it's not just technology, it's a number of things that have converged that allow businesses today to do things that they couldn't think of. So we've been talking about telecommuting for 30 years. There's a reason it didn't happen, and probably took a crisis for it to happen, but we couldn't do everything that we can otherwise do online real time. We'd have to download. We would be desynchronized. You'd need to wait for synchronization. Right now, if we're 2 on the same file at the same time, I'll see your upgrades as you see my updates. It doesn't really make a whole lot of difference. So probably the second change is the same way as these technological organizations like Microsoft and others are showing us the way. Our own organizations have to continue to invest massively in a transformation that's based on digital. And that's not only true about the service industry, it's also true about retail, manufacturing, 3D additive manufacturing, or online commerce. I mean, there are 2 examples amongst many. And when local politicians right now are saying bringing back a lot of manufacturing to Canada, it's a valid statement because the labor component, which was the most expensive component, is crushed by technology. So if you're using additive manufacturing, using 3D techniques, it's not 100 people in the plant. It's machinery, robots, and software and engineering.
Fascinating, and the technology is so fast evolving. Let's talk for a minute about your clients. 2 areas that you've focused on. One is small business, the other is tourism. What, particularly as it relates to small business, what have you seen as the impacts? We've found that small businesses have been hit far harder than larger businesses have, and that a higher percentage of them won't survive. What have you found among your client base?
Well, this is a real economic crisis. It's gigantic of magnitude. It's global. A lot of businesses are on an artificial respirator. Governments, when they send out a signal that say that we're going to go in hibernation, comes with it the responsibility to help the taxpayer, whether it's corporate or human or per person. And they did that. I would say, very well. When the respirators are removed, we'll see the reality. In the meantime, there hasn't been as many bankruptcies as one would have expected, but there's been so much money injected. And you're right about smaller businesses having had a different impact versus larger businesses. Again, as I said earlier, you can't really measure anything with averages anymore. So it's really industry specific, region specific. So some industries are naturally more resilient. Take insurance, for example, naturally more resilient than other industries like tourism or hotels or restaurants, where, first of all, I'm going to make a statement that's really, really frightening. If you take just about any business and ask it from one day to the next to work from 100% capacity to 85% capacity, most of them will lose money. So that's a huge statement. unless they change something. So cost containment and ways of doing things and going to market. So businesses are geared for a volume. You take away 20% of their volume, the costs are still there. They're not making any money. So all businesses are affected. Now, the most resilient businesses, the ones that had the most liquidity, or where they were in industries that weren't otherwise already sick, because there were some industries that were struggling already. Amazon is not a new phenomenon, and it took away a lot of market from retailers. Well, in those industries, especially the smaller ones, you have two categories of business people. Some of them reacted with tremendous amount of creativity and innovation, and almost like on a dime, shifted their business models. So for example, they started making medical devices because that's what it was in demand, and they had the equipment to do that. So if you go from plastic bags to masks, I've seen that, that's an example. Or in a restaurant, for example, where the whole family, from grandfather to son to grandson to son, all butchers who now have a chain of restaurants, but the butcher shops are still working. So they created staging areas in the restaurants with pickups on Thursday, Friday, Saturday. People come and get their food for the entire week already made really quickly, and off their phone can place the order, can get their appointment for pickup and so on. So they were very creative. They did something very quickly. Of course, they had the courage to invest in their business at a moment in time when one would not expect it, to keep their very best. In fact, maybe increase their salaries, because of course, if you give $2,000 a person to every person that's not working, you may have trouble finding lower salaried individuals. So they have to make some decisions, reduce their numbers, and deal with their very best. But we have found a lot of organizations have shifted and done that very quickly. We also find some industries were not already ill, became temporarily ill. For example, tourism in Canada and Quebec wasn't already ill. They had 15 years of successive growth. And then all of a sudden, a guillotine. Those businesses, you have to buy time for them, because that will come back once the underlying medical problem goes away. That will come back. I think will come back really quickly. And others who were already sick, which would have probably survived for 3, 4, 5 years, but suddenly in a very short period of time will find themselves cash strapped, seeking out help in other ways, and potentially having to file for bankruptcy. And that we haven't seen the full brunt of it. I think by January, we'll start seeing what the real impacts are, January, February, maybe a little earlier, but January, February, we'll start seeing the real impacts, and many small businesses will not survive. It's a sad fact.
Let's look at tourism for a minute. Usually Montreal, where you're based, is a hub of activity during the summer, with festivals, with car racing. It's just enormously vibrant. And yet this year, of course, all of that was shut down. You couldn't go ahead with that. But even in the tourism sector, which is been so badly hit across Canada in the aggregate, it varies from sector to sector, from region to region. You found in Quebec that in some areas, tourism was up dramatically.
We have offices throughout Quebec. Our offices in Gaspésie, Bas-Saint-Laurent, have seen tourism boom. The month of September, which is a very slow month, I mean, water's freezing already at this point in time. They're fully booked, fully booked, and for very long periods of time. Now, there's no Americans, so clearly they're all Canadian or Quebecois. It's a real shift in the way people are spending money. The downtown Montreal area is easing back into full operation, but slowly, very slowly. It's not normal, not by a long shot, because as I said, the taller buildings are hard to fill, next to impossible to fill in a reasonable amount of time. So a lot of people are still working from home. People working from home will have to make decisions as to whether they want to even change where they live. And some of these office towers will see these changes reflect in their tenant base. So I think you'll see change in vocation of some of the real estate. So there will be significant impact on both residential and commercial and industrial real estate. Probably industrial less, but the residential and commercial will have to make some decisions. We see some signals, because when the Caisse de dépôt, for example, decides to indicate that they're taking a write down on their commercial real estate space, that's because their valuation, in their opinion, has gone through a reset. They will, because they have massive amounts of money, find new uses and new vocations for their properties, and they'll invest in them, taking into account what the new reality looks like.
When you look at hotels, it's interesting, it's striking that it's the urban hotels that are particularly hard hit because no convention business, no Christmas parties, none of that.
Hotels right now are in Montreal are at approximately 10% occupancy, when normally at this time of year they'd be at 80%. I'm in the office right now. As I was walking to the office, you witness something that I've never seen. I grew up here, and I walked by Rosalis, which is the main restaurant of the Fairmont Hotel, at 7:30 this morning. There would have been clients and the business community. It's the Power Breakfast spot. It was closed this morning. So clearly there's a huge impact right now.
It's enormous. Let's shift to public policy. The Parliament will be back very soon. There will be a new speech from the throne. The government will be setting out its agenda for recovery. You're called upon to advise governments as well. Mm-hmm. What advice would you be giving to the government at this point as they look at how to transition from a subsidies-based economy to one where families and businesses can be more self-reliant, where we resume growth?
Yeah, well, the first thing is I think intervention from governments in a situation where, like this one, is not a switch. It's not on off, it's a dimmer. So you got to put your finger on the dimmer and move it to the right place. So it won't go off suddenly. So that's the first thing. Second is, had they done nothing, the alternative is completely unacceptable. So doing what was done was important. I'm a very strong believer. If you look at anything I've ever said or written, I keep repeating employment, 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 employment. Quality of life is highly dependent on employment. To govern is to take wealth and redistribute. In order to take wealth and redistribute, you have to have wealth. 2/3 of the wealth coming from budget envelopes comes from GST, the equivalent provincial taxes, a tax on income, federal, provincial. These are all deductions at source on labor. So employment is the key. And a rich society such as ours will have choices to make. We're an extremely rich country, especially with regards to resources. Of course, it has to be exploited responsibly for future generations. But we're going to have to create new wealth to maintain the quality of life. I was a little surprised that the federal government, during a period of full employment, had a lot of trouble coming up with a balanced budget, and had all kinds of reasons to explain it away. But from a business point of view, I think it's important when the time is right that you be able to do that. The new Minister of Finance, and I think it's very refreshing that there be a change there, will have a challenge and must come up with a program. Taxpayers deserve to know, how do we get out of this, over how many years, because it will take many years. And what does it look like? It also has to send a signal to, for example, credit agencies who determine, right now, interest rates are very, very, very low. They may not stay that way. So we have to send signals that we're managing ourselves to the credit agencies. We're not in a vacuum here. So there are international credit agencies that have to be able to bite into something. To say that we don't have enough information or that there's too much uncertainty to be able to come up with budgets, to me, it doesn't make any sense. I'm a business person, as I said. Well, come up with a 3-month budget if you can't come up with a 12-month budget or a 10-year budget, but there's got to be a path out of it. The European Economic Commission came up with a plan, which in Canadian dollars is $1 trillion, but that there is a program, and it says it'll take 30 years to get out of this, and how they're going to spend it and where it's going. So I think the population needs that. Of course, coming out of a health crisis, there will be, and we are already in what I would call a public finances crisis. And that crisis has to also have its own next steps and a way out. And I'd like to hear programs. So what do the programs look to unlock the wealth so that we're investing, putting money in the right places? When do we start seeing the dimmer in terms of help come down, and what is it replaced by? and what's the program to return to a balanced budget. We have a new reality, and we can't just bury our heads in the sand and pretend that we don't have to act responsibly.
So if I understand you correctly, your argument isn't that the government didn't need to step in and make extraordinary payments during the crisis, that it was essential that they keep people, both families and businesses, afloat. But that's one-time emergency spending that does have a hit on the national debt, but isn't structural. Yeah. Your concern would be as if they moved to permanent spending, which became structural, and then as interest rates began to go back up again, we found that interest payments simply crowded out all other expenditures.
Your summary is absolutely accurate. You can't send people home, tell them not to work and not do anything. That's part of being a society. So it falls in the hands of government, and then you have to have a path out and a way out, and you have to communicate. I mean, we talked earlier about technology and its role. I think leadership also was an element of it when we talked about governance. But the third piece is communicate, communicate, communicate. So in the same way I have to communicate with my suppliers, my employees, my clients, government have stakeholders. They range from their taxpayers to the credit agencies to their own banking and the Bank of Canada. They must communicate, 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 and communicate. It's a minimum. So I mean, that if you're not doing that, you're not doing your job. So they were elected to do that. They've gone through some changes. I see that as a very positive thing. I think that you know, you and I are different people, so we're equipped with different skill sets. Comes a time where you need a new skill set, bring the new skill set. So if during a period where we had full employment, we were having trouble coming up with balanced budgets, now we need somebody else to be able to come out with a program and the way forward. So I'm looking forward to hearing that. So
the first thing you'll be looking for from the speech from the throne is a coherent strategy, one that's well communicated.
I'd like to hear realism, scenario planning, and programs over time. And I would certainly like that these pieces of information would be supported with empirics, so that credit agencies who won't buy just words are able to analyze them and conclude as to their legitimacy.
We're looking at a deficit this year of over $300 billion, probably.
Yeah, well, the 300 billion is only part of it. It's over 1,000 billion in accumulated debt. So you can't just disregard what's already there. I think it's 1.2 billion or 1.1 something billion. So that's the number that we need a program on, not just it's return. To me, it's return to a balanced budget will take how long, and how do we get out of the 1.2 billion in time?
You anticipated my question. Can you cut your way back to balance?
We will have to make choices for sure. Can't pretend that we can afford everything. Were we doing everything efficiently? I doubt it. So can we use technology, for example, to improve services? Absolutely. Should we be, no stone should be left unturned. But I do repeat that first and foremost, my first line is we are a wealthy country. Not all countries are wealthy, and unlocking that wealth will be the first challenge. I think that the taxpayers deserve good quality of life and access to services, and one doesn't exclude the other. That doesn't mean that we should be burning money. So if there are things that don't need to be done anymore, or if there's services that have become obsolete and that have just been kept because it was the way we always did things, well, we're gonna have to make choices on those. But my first focus would be, where do we invest to capitalize on creating wealth in the future?
And you would differentiate between investing and spending money.
Well, yeah, because when temporarily you say we're going to create a $2,000 a month envelope, that's to buy groceries. That's not investment. Investment is a direction on a raw material that might have an international appeal, or on manufacturing, like we mentioned, 3D manufacturing, where you get high labor costs, fewer numbers, but very well-educated engineers working on project and bringing back equipment and robotics and so on and so forth. So I think those would be interesting areas to see the future. And we have areas where we have incredible expertise. So seeing robotics and 3D being developed on those areas where we have incredible expertise would be interesting, and seeing it being exported. If we had recurring trade surpluses, it would be amazing because that would be money coming from the outside to pay for our debt. If we have more foreign direct investment, it's fresh money coming from other countries that's going to pay for employment here. And employment is the source of most of the budgets. If you have, I don't know, if we brought back, for example, immigrant investors, which is always controversial because it's immigration. But if the immigrant investor is bringing, for example, $1 million into the economy, and you have 4,000 a year, that's $4 billion of new money coming into the country that we would never otherwise have seen. We could redistribute that in a different way. So I'm looking forward to seeing those kinds of things come out of the discussion.
An unfair question to put to you. What would be the time frame for balancing the federal budget?
I don't believe that the federal budget will be balanced within a decade. It's going to take, I don't know, 30 years, some number like that. But they have to come up, they have to chisel out a plan and a program. And what are the key drivers? I'm sorry? Yeah, strategy. I'm hoping there's only going to be 4 key drivers. So some of it might be, like you said, cost containment and making choices, but a lot of it will be industry related and regionally related. So where are the investments going to create these jobs and to create new wealth that would otherwise not have come? And that should be the plan, that you can create the scenarios, put it in a timeline, give it a direction, and communicate it properly.
Final question for you. You are really well positioned to look at the Canadian economy and at Canada's role in the world. Clearly, we have mountains in front of us that we have to climb, but as you look down the road, 10, 15 years down the road, are you basically an optimist or a pessimist about Canada's prospects for the future?
Well, when they ask if the glass is half full or half empty, I always say the glass is always full. Half of it may be water and the other half air, but it's always full. So I'm very much an optimist. 2 things, after every great crisis comes opportunity, potentially even prosperity. So I think this will not be any different. Optimism statistically is coming back up. Quebec is leading, by the way, on statistics for optimism. So it sank by almost 25 points. It's now back up 10 points, which is a very good indicator. I have a lot of confidence in creativity and innovation of Canadian entrepreneurs. I have a lot of confidence in the unlocked wealth that exists in the country. I believe that we've discussed opportunities that in technology earlier in the conversation. Even our own firm invested in an acquisition in cybersecurity and an acquisition in robot process automation. 60 people, primarily financial people, doing that. And we see clients doing that kind of stuff. So my answer is very, very optimistic, very optimistic. But at the same time, and it's a small but, no capital B, the but is we need to demonstrate structure, rigor, and have a plan. We need to demonstrate leadership. We have to communicate the plan. And a big piece of it will be digital.
Emilio, it's been fascinating. Thank you for sharing your insights. We could be going on for hours. You are a fount of wisdom, and I thank you very much.
Perrin, I thank you for inviting me. I feel honored that we could have this conversation today. Thank you very much.
Bye.